World War I soldiers' experiences. The British soldiers of the war were initially volunteers but increasingly were conscripted into service. Surviving veterans, returning home, often found they could discuss their experiences only amongst themselves. Grouping together, they formed veterans associations or legions. A small number of personal accounts of American veterans have been collected by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Prisoners of war. About 8 million men surrendered and were held in POW camps during the war. All nations pledged to follow the Hague Conventions on fair treatment of prisoners of war, and the survival rate for POWs was generally much higher than that of combatants at the front. Individual surrenders were uncommon, large units usually surrendered en masse. At the Siege of Maubeuge about 40,000 French soldiers surrendered. At the Battle of Galicia Russians took about 100,000 to 120,000 Austrian captives. At the Brusilov offensive about 325,000 to 417,000 Germans and Austrians surrendered to Russians, and at the Battle of Tannenberg 92,000 Russians surrendered. When the besieged garrison of Kaunas surrendered in 1915, some 20,000 Russians became prisoners. At the battle near Pertsosnice, February to March 1915, 14,000 Germans surrendered to Russians, and at the First Battle of the Marne about 12,000 Germans surrendered to the Allies. 25 to 31% of Russian losses, as a proportion of those captured, wounded, or killed, were to prisoner status, for Austria-Hungary 32%, for Italy 26%, for France 12%, for Germany 9%, for Britain 7%. Prisoners from the Allied armies totaled about 1.4 million, not including Russia, which lost 2.5 to 3.5 million men as prisoners. From the Central Powers about 3.3 million men became prisoners, most of them surrendered to Russians. Germany held 2.5 million prisoners, Russia held 2.2 to 2.9 million, while Britain and France held about 720,000. Most were captured just before the armistice. The United States held 48,000. The most dangerous moment was the act of surrender, when helpless soldiers were sometimes gunned down. Once prisoners reached a camp, conditions were, in general, satisfactory, and much better than in World War II, thanks in part to the efforts of the International Red Cross and inspections by neutral nations. However, conditions were terrible in Russia. Starvation was common for prisoners and civilians alike. About 15 to 20% of the prisoners in Russia died, and in Central Powers imprisonment 8% of Russians. In Germany, food was scarce, but only 5% died. The Ottoman Empire often treated POWs poorly. Some 11,800 British Empire soldiers, most of them Indians, became prisoners after the siege of Kut in Mesopotamia in April 1916. 4,250 died in captivity. Although many were in a poor condition when captured, Ottoman officers forced them to march first, 100 kilometers, 684 miles, to Anatolia. A survivor said, "We were driven along like beasts, to drop out was to die." The survivors were then forced to build a railway through the Taurus Mountains. In Russia, when the prisoners from the Czech Legion of the Austro-Hungarian Army were released in 1917, they rearmed themselves and briefly became a military and diplomatic force during the Russian Civil War. While the Allied prisoners of the Central Powers were quickly sent home at the end of active hostilities, the same treatment was not granted to Central Power prisoners of the Allies and Russia, many of whom served as forced labor, for example, in France until 1920. They were released only after many approaches by the Red Cross to the Allied Supreme Council. German prisoners were still being held in Russia as late as 1924. Military attachés and war correspondents. Military and civilian observers from every major power closely followed the course of the war. Many were able to report on events from a perspective somewhat akin to modern embedded positions within the opposing land and naval forces.